Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Leila in the Netherlands toku tūranga waiwai, ke kirikiri roa tuku kāinga nainei, ko Ottilie Stolte toku ingoa. I'm Ottilie Stolte and I'm presenting on behalf of a group of colleagues who have collaborated in a decade of research-informed teaching practice and an ongoing international discussion about the discipline. Central for us have been questions about what kind of psychological scholarship can best facilitate human flourishing in a 21st century globalised context. This has led to the production of the second edition of an undergraduate textbook titled Social Psychology in Everyday Life. Why did we start this project? It started with a concern that most mainstream textbooks in psychology do not seem sufficiently responsive to societal changes or to the needs and interests of our students. Our objective has been to create an alternative to the mainstream textbooks which are primarily coming out of the US. Being more inclusive of the global south does not mean that our book ignores minority world contexts or that it overlooks the psychological needs of more affluent or advantaged people. In our book, we also cover the knowledge and history of the westernised Anglophone worldview. However, one thing we do not do is to assume that this minority world experience and worldview is a universal norm from which to judge the rest of humanity. So in both editions of Social Psychology in Everyday Life, we embrace the rich histories of psychology and we seek to be more responsive to our students from diverse cultures and life worlds. The human experience today is one of intense change, uncertainty, contradictions, conflicts, and crisis. But it is also about remarkable connectivity, knowledge, diversity, and possibility. We need a psychology that can deal with this complexity and with the challenges of interlocking and interdependent systems. Given this context, there is a growing need for a more engaged and relational psychology. So, what do we mean by this? Much of mainstream social psychology has become fairly detached, disembodied, and dematerialized. Our focus, therefore, has been on finding ways to collapse the social distance between ourselves and the people and the communities that we work with. Some of the ways we work and what we present in the book may seem quite straightforward, but an engaged and relational approach is one where we take the time to connect and to listen, to work with and alongside people, not simply harvest data from them or impose interventions on them. A focus on building bridges rather than walls, and to create space for other people's worldviews or experiences. So from an engaged relational standpoint, human beings are not seen to exist as separate, autonomous, disembodied units, but instead in relation to their social, material, and cultural environments. All human beings can, of course, have their own original thoughts, but we are always both an individual and collective phenomena. So we need social psychology that can encompass both. Hence, understanding social problems and psychological issues in context and not just as individual deficits is crucially important, as is seeing the whole person. So an engaged relational psychology attempts to work on the problems that individuals and groups encounter in their everyday lives in a given society. This is simply in contrast to simply trying to adjust people to the status quo or turning individuals and groups themselves into the problem. It means doing more than improving, it means doing more to improve people's living conditions, not just their behaviours and attitudes. Trying to think in a more relational way may not come naturally given the societal dominance of individualism and the focus on treating individuals or just their families in psychology. Yet the statements on this slide are excellent reminders that we cannot solve disease or disorder just by treating individuals. As Aristotle understood, one cannot have good people in the absence of good societies. Hence, societies have a moral obligation to ensure all citizens have a supported life. COVID-19 is just one of the many societal crises today, but it has hopefully shown us how ineffective a focus just on individual interests can be. Simply hoarding loo paper is not going to save us. New Zealand has received a lot of attention for its COVID response. Clearly, New Zealand has many advantages as a small island nation at the bottom of the world. We also still have a reasonable level of trust and social capital. We were fortunate that in New Zealand we did not have Fox News dominating discussions, but instead had a Prime Minister who was prepared to listen to health experts, and those health experts have communicated with the population very clearly and with some excellent graphics to help them get the message across, such as the one on the slide. Nonetheless, New Zealand is not, well, not all of it is an idyllic paradise. We have extreme wealth inequalities, severely unaffordable housing, homelessness, food insecurity, health inequalities, and racism. There is much more work to do in New Zealand. If only we could employ the same collective effort we have had and have shown with COVID to resolve some of these other entrenched problems. Our efforts to write the undergraduate textbook arises out of a paradox at the heart of modern psychology. Most mainstream training focuses on learning the techniques and practices of a detached observer to avoid bias and subjectivity, and many of us who teach at the postgraduate level and try to support students doing qualitative research often go through a process of having to unlearn some of these techniques that have been sort of at the core of the undergraduate program. Yet, how can one fully understand other human beings if we rely too much on reducing human experiences to variables? All of us as authors value what lab experiments and statistics can tell us, but as the founders of social psychology, such as Solomon Asch and even before William James, these methods are too limited for understanding the social dimensions of the human experience. Hence, a relational approach allows us to connect individual actions to multiple levels and processes. For example, with a problem like obesity, we do not see this solely as people making bad decisions, such as buying a pie from the convenience store instead of making themselves a quinoa salad. So the core ideas underpinning our book reflect efforts to write a textbook that is more global in scope and does not rely primarily on an individualistic and monocultural version of social psychologies. This means extending beyond weird samples that have dominated the discipline. The 95% of people on the planet live in life worlds and conditions that are vastly different from the 5% on which most psychology textbooks are based. The second edition hit the shelves in February 2020 at a time of significant change in the discipline of psychology. The approach in our book is endorsed by the APA as the direction in which mainstream US psychology needs to move in order to meet the challenges of the 21st century. One of our co-authors is Professor Stuart Carr, who is co-chair of the APA Committee for International Relations in Psychology. This committee has outlined a set of objectives for psychology to become more global, multicultural, and to have a stronger focus on issues of social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are not saying that everything is wrong with mainstream individualistic psychology, but that this is a limited view. Throughout most of history and in most cultures, people have been seen as enmeshed into their social worlds. While many institutions in Western countries are still built on the base of an individualistic worldview, this is a recent historical invention and therefore it can be changed. As the final chapter of our book concludes, the discipline of psychology has a lot to offer and many ideas have stood the test of time. But to be effective, the discipline needs to engage more with people and events as these unfold within the dynamic, messy, and complex dimensions of people's everyday lived experiences. This means a broader range of methods are needed. We also need better understandings of the significance of historical events and societal processes such as migration, colonization, politics, health crises, environmental issues, and social change. This book is unique in being the first undergraduate social psychology textbook to include a chapter on Indigenous psychologies. This was important to us since Indigenous knowledges have much to offer in terms of reclaiming understandings of the interconnected self. Hence, for us, Indigenous views form part of the philosophical underpinnings of psychology. instead of being viewed as something on the margins, or worse still, when Indigenous people are only talked about in relation to negative health or social statistics, or as a cultural curiosity. We also need to think more critically about whose interests are served by psychology. Too often it is the interests of dominant rather than oppressed and marginalised groups. So overall, our book offers a more hopeful and liberating view of the self, one where each of us has the potential to learn from our mistakes and be our best selves. But we need to do much more to address the problems arising from harmful societal contexts. Each chapter in our book begins with a scenario of recognisable everyday situations to get students applying concepts to real-world contexts. The book is written in a narrative style, and there are a set of core ideas that run right through the entire book. The first of these relates to the self. In mainstream psychology, the self is typically seen as an enclosed, independent, lonely individual with fixed traits who reasons and behaves in predictable ways. In our book, the self is seen as fundamentally interwoven with other people, places, and things. The interconnected self, therefore, offers a more dynamic, socially, politically, and economically situated vision of who human beings are. This leads to the second point. Human life does not occur in a vacuum. Context is always relevant. What we mean, however, is much more than simply viewing the environments as a source of stimuli or social influences. It involves conceptualizing people in ways that are entwined within and inseparable from the everyday context of their lives, since where and how people live can enable or constrain their well-being. Further, too much psychology simply treats culture as a variable or as an aspect of individual identity. There is now a slow but steady acknowledgement that even the discipline itself is a product of culture, where certain cultural norms have been privileged at the expense of others. As the world becomes more globalized, it is important to embrace culture and diversity both within the discipline and in terms of understanding the people we work with. The third theme is the need to take research insights into action. To be effective, psychology cannot just sit on the sidelines. Trying to be neutral and objective is in effect a political act, since this usually results in supporting the status quo. Yet the status quo is often something that needs to be challenged and changed. Our discipline is about improving human well-being. There is a lot to do given the extent of human suffering. We need to be prepared to act and to advocate in order to better support people and communities facing hardship and adversity. Our book is not an end, but simply part of an ongoing dialogue. We have drawn on the ideas of many scholars, and we see this book as a contribution towards the development of an increasingly inclusive, pluralistic, and responsive psychology. We hope to contribute to a discipline in which people from around the globe can recognise themselves. We encourage students to develop their own psychology that draws on theories and concepts that from the store of knowledge in psychology, but also on their own life experiences, their interests and their hopes for the future. And that requires perspective rather than an objective and detached position. Our book ends with the suggestion that the best way for readers to predict the future of psychology is actually to help create it. What we hope is that students can head into their future with a greater sense of hope, understanding and interpersonal connectivity from which to explore the rich diversity of human life.